Step back in time to explore the vanished cigarette brands that once crowded every convenience store shelf, shaping the everyday habits of countless Americans. Our journey uncovers the cultural impact these logos, slogans, and glossy magazine ads had on the mid to late 20th century, from the Hollywood-inspired glamour of the 1930s and 1940s to the edgy campaigns of the 1970s. As health awareness and shifting attitudes transformed the marketplace, once iconic names quietly disappeared, leaving behind little more than faded billboards and elusive collector's items. In this video, we'll revisit a handful of those forgotten cigarettes, examining how they captured the spirit of their era, whether through lavish promotions, catchy jingles, or distinctive packaging designs. We do not promote smoking or disregard its known risks. Instead, we'll celebrate the nostalgic stories hidden within these long-lost brands, revealing how they reflected, and ultimately succumbed to, America's evolving culture and regulations. Number 1. Chesterfield. Known for its distinctive taste and memorable advertising campaigns, Chesterfield cigarettes date back to the early decades of the 20th century and gained a particularly strong following in the 1930s and 1940s, often appearing in black and white print ads featuring popular celebrities of the golden age of Hollywood. Baby boomers recall how, in the 1950s, Chesterfield commercials punctuated TV broadcasts, where famous actors or actresses held the pack, smiling while praising the brand's mild yet satisfying flavor. During the 1960s, with health warnings rising in prominence, Chesterfield's marketing pivoted slightly, emphasizing quality tobacco over flavor, claims that might have drawn regulatory scrutiny. By the 1970s, America was shifting its attitudes towards cigarettes, and Chesterfield struggled to maintain relevance amid a crowded marketplace dominated by giants investing heavily in new campaigns. While lingering in some local stores into the 1980s, Chesterfield's star power waned as competition tightened and public awareness of smoking risks grew. Older adults can still recall those nostalgic TV spots echoing from living room sets, capturing a bygone America before extensive regulations took hold. Eventually, Chesterfield was folded into limited production for international markets, with many Americans forgetting the once ubiquitous brand. Its presence in black and white film reels, old TV commercials, and retro magazine archives keeps its memory alive, but you won't see it prominently stocked in mainstream U.S. shops anymore. For many baby boomers who grew up around its jingles, the brand's disappearance symbolizes a shift away from the permissive environment that once allowed TV commercials to glamorize smoking, leaving Chesterfield as a piece of historical nostalgia rather than a staple on cigarette racks. Number 2. Old Gold. This brand emerged in the 1920s, but it truly rose to prominence throughout the 1930s and 1940s with those snappy print ads that boasted, "Not a cough in a carload," while showcasing flappers or film stars from the old Hollywood scene. Old Gold's marketing sometimes featured elaborate contests or cross-promotions with radio programs of the era, leveraging the golden age of radio to spread its catchy slogans. By the 1950s, baby boomers remember seeing Old Gold commercials during variety TV shows, often with dancers or comedic sketches extolling the smooth experience. However, from the late 1950s into the 1960s, consumer tastes began shifting. New filter cigarettes swept the market, and Old Gold's non-filter reputation left it struggling to keep pace. In the 1970s, American nostalgia for older brands did exist, but the brand's attempt to modernize with filters and different packaging sometimes felt dated compared to more contemporary rivals that appealed to the rock and roll generation. Eventually, increased scrutiny of health impacts and greater competition made it difficult for Old Gold to remain widely available. By the 1980s, it was rarely spotted in everyday grocery stores, fading into the background of retro cigarette lore. Old Gold has a nostalgic presence in vintage commercials, old movies, and certain vintage sign collections, reflecting a time when Art Deco aesthetics and glamorous Hollywood references still held strong sway over consumer choices. As regulations tightened, the brand vanished from many shelves, leaving behind a legacy that baby boomers and nostalgic collectors may still remember from countless black and white ad clippings. Number 3. Triton. Famous for its slogan, "Us Triton smokers would rather fight than switch," Triton carved out a unique identity in the 1960s thanks to print ads showing models with a black eye, presumably from battling to defend their brand loyalty. That edgy campaign stuck in the minds of many Gen Xers and older baby boomers who saw these ads in popular magazines of the 1960s and 1970s. Triton first hit the market decades earlier, but it reached peak cultural resonance during the mid-century push for brand differentiation. The packaging's bold design, red, white, and black, stood out in convenience stores and local shops across old America. Meanwhile, as the 1970s progressed, competition from new low-tar and menthol variants chipped away at Triton's audience. Changing consumer preferences, spurred by broader health awareness and the desire for milder flavors, meant Triton's once infamous marketing approach started to feel outdated. By the early 1980s, Triton was no longer the household name it had been, with limited distribution preventing younger generations from getting to know the brand. Though old Triton print ads remain a common sight in vintage photo albums or collections of classic Americana, you'd be hard-pressed to find a fresh pack today at a typical U.S. retailer. With cultural shifts and anti-smoking sentiments on the rise, Triton had little room to reinvent itself successfully, leaving its Black Eye campaign to linger as an unforgettable relic of mid-20th century marketing bravado. Number 4. Raleigh. Coming from a line of cigarette brands that offered premium experiences, Raleigh also attempted to entice smokers with coupons redeemable for household items, which was a trend some brands pursued in the 1960s and 1970s to foster loyalty. Baby boomers might recall parents saving Raleigh coupons in jars, exchanging them for toasters, clocks, or other household merchandise. This unique approach harnessed post-war America's enthusiasm for consumer goods, especially during the 1950s and 1960s, when brand loyalty was paramount and many advertisers catered to stay-at-home mothers who often managed the household. Raleigh's packaging, emblazoned with a classic crest and script lettering, helped convey a sense of tradition or old-world sophistication, elements that resonated in a nostalgic environment where references to Europe or historical elegance often signaled prestige. However, the brand's long-term viability was challenged in the 1970s, when anti-tobacco campaigns gained traction and younger consumers drifted to bolder marketing from competitors. Although Raleigh tried various filter innovations, it didn't quite capture the dynamic vibe that the Gen X generation found appealing in some newer brands that targeted the rock and roll lifestyle. By the 1980s, stricter regulations on cigarette promotions, combined with the brand's aging appeal, led to a diminishing presence in stores. Today, it's rare to come across Raleigh outside of niche collector circles who remember saving those coupons or discovering them in the back of a kitchen drawer. Much like the old commercials from the 20th century, Raleigh has slipped into the realm of forgotten memorabilia. Number 5. True. Launched by Lorillard in the late 1960s to meet consumer demand for lower tar and nicotine options, True cigarettes gained a foothold during the transitional period when medical reports about smoking-related diseases were becoming mainstream. Packaged with a sleek, minimalistic design, True projected a modern sense of responsibility, aligning with a wave of new health-conscious marketing that peaked in the 1970s. Advertisements often depicted scenic outdoor backdrops, families enjoying picnics, or sports references, implying an active, wholesome lifestyle that, ironically, felt contradictory when paired with cigarette use. Nonetheless, baby boomers and some early Gen Xers encountered these campaigns on billboards and in full-color magazine spreads. The brand's softer approach to flavor and lowered tar content was a novelty at the time, attracting some individuals who wanted to keep smoking while feeling they were choosing a safer alternative. However, as the 1980s ushered in even more rigorous public awareness about the dangers of smoking, Along with evolving legal restrictions on tobacco advertising, True faced the challenge of remaining competitive. Younger consumers found the brand's identity less compelling, overshadowed by edgier or more aggressively marketed brands. Eventually, True's market share withered, disappearing from many convenience store shelves and becoming a mere footnote in the history of low-tar cigarette experiments. Although references to True can still be found in old print ads or archived commercials, it remains nearly impossible to encounter a pack in typical retail outlets, marking it as one more piece of vintage nostalgia. Number 6. Life. Introduced as a brand focusing on lighter taste before major regulatory changes kicked in, Life cigarettes tried to push the notion of healthier smoking by touting a moderate content of tar and nicotine. It hit mainstream shelves sometime around the 1970s, a period when numerous brands added filter variations or mild offshoots to address growing consumer anxieties. Life's packaging displayed bright colors and a clean aesthetic, aiming to distance itself from the darker, more traditional designs of older companies. Magazine ads showed everyday people, family gatherings, folks in casual attire, or couples sharing a quiet moment, suggesting this was a friendlier, less intense choice. But as public skepticism about cigarette health claims grew through the late 1970s, many adult smokers dismissed brand images that played up the illusion of safe smoking. Legislation that enforced more accurate labeling also pushed Life into a corner, undermining the brand's marketing angle. By the 1980s, the entire concept of a healthier cigarette was rapidly losing credibility, and Life's brand identity couldn't stand up to shifting attitudes. Baby boomers who spotted it on store shelves in the past eventually noticed that it disappeared without much fanfare, overshadowed by bigger names that managed to adapt their approach or simply had deeper pockets for advertising. Now, Life exists primarily in the occasional reference found in magazine archives, old commercials, or among collectors who compile defunct cigarette brand packs as a reminder of the days when glossy ads tried to reconcile smoking with a wholesome, everyday lifestyle. Number 7. Sano. Marketed in mid-century America as a low-nicotine option, Sano was one of the earliest attempts to appeal to the health concerns that quietly emerged as early as the 1930s and 1940s, well before public consensus shifted. By the 1950s, as medical reports started connecting smoking with serious illnesses, certain niche brands like Sano tried to carve out a new category. Advertisements sometimes featured scenes in suburban neighborhoods with smiling couples or individuals engaged in recreational activities to signal a calmer, safer experience. But the brand never truly broke into the mainstream, overshadowed by bigger marketing budgets from the major tobacco players. Those who came of age in the 1960s or 1970s and were searching for novel alternatives might have briefly encountered Sano in catalogs or specialized tobacco shops. Its limited distribution and niche identity, however, prevented it from becoming a household name. By the 1970s, as more robust regulations on advertising arrived and the concept of safer cigarettes was widely questioned, Sano lost any foothold it had. Baby boomers who recalled seeing it might have done so in passing, possibly in an old commercial break during late-night TV or in dusty magazine pages showcasing a brand that promised gentle impact. Sano's final downfall came with the influx of bigger, more established brands launching their own mild or low-tar lines, rendering Sano redundant and ultimately pushing it off the market. Today, it remains an obscure reference, surfacing only in dedicated collector groups or tobacco history write-ups that note Sano's failed attempt at persuading Americans they could keep smoking and simultaneously mitigate health fears. Number 8. Saratoga. Introduced in the late 1960s, Saratoga featured notably slim and elongated cigarette sticks that sought to tap into the sophisticated image markets of the era, reminiscent of how Virginia Slims gained traction among female consumers. Saratoga appealed to individuals who wanted a more refined, possibly European-inspired vibe, playing on the retro aesthetic that romanticized 1920s and 30s glamour. Advertisements included polished imagery of stylish parties, swirling cocktails, and upscale social gatherings, positioning Saratoga as something you'd see in old Hollywood films or among the upper crust in old America. Its presence persisted in the early 1970s, though overshadowed by larger campaigns from well-funded competitors. As the decade wore on, baby boomers who had become more cost-conscious and health-conscious drifted to either budget-friendly brands or those offering light or menthol variations. Saratoga's distinct shape and marketing angle slowly became archaic, as the popularity of ultra-slim cigarettes was replaced by the next wave of newly formulated hundreds, or 12s, that boasted various filters. By the 1980s, Saratoga was increasingly hard to find, falling victim to the mainstreaming of other more aggressively promoted brands. Today, references to Saratoga remain rare. You can spot them in vintage magazine ads that occasionally resurface in nostalgia forums or YouTube compilations of old cigarette commercials, but you won't see a fresh pack in gas station displays. For collectors of tobacco memorabilia, locating a Saratoga pack, especially in good condition, can be a prized addition to a retro collection, symbolizing a forgotten attempt to add an air of posh sophistication to the average smoke break. Number 9. Belair. Promoted heavily in the 1960s and 1970s as a refreshing menthol option, Belair tried to stand out with bright packaging and ocean-themed or breezy imagery, an attempt to position the brand as a crisp alternative for those weary of heavier cigarettes. Baby boomers recall encountering Belair in vending machines commonly found in bowling alleys, diners, and other casual social spots of mid-century America. Commercials at the time often featured scenic locales, from palm-fringed beaches to suburban yards, hinting that Belair offered a gentle, cool draw for people on the go. Despite capturing a segment of the market that appreciated the smoother menthol taste, Belair struggled to compete against more robust menthol names that delivered a stronger brand identity. The 1970s saw an influx of new menthol lines as major tobacco companies scrambled to refine flavors and packaging to appeal to an increasingly diverse audience, including rock and roll fans, rebellious youth, and older folks looking for a milder hit. Over time, Belair's brand message faded, overshadowed by more recognizable menthol giants that had deeper pockets for celebrity endorsements or large-scale promotions. By the 1980s, Belair was almost entirely overshadowed, found mostly in limited regions where loyal longtime smokers continued to pick up a pack out of habit. Once those distribution contracts ended, Belair simply disappeared from many shelves. Today, it lives on as an obscure footnote in the annals of vintage cigarette advertisements, a faint memory for the baby boomers who might catch a glimpse of an old Belair poster in a collector's garage sale or a dusty thrift shop. Number 10. Diplomat. One of the lesser-known brands that briefly held a niche audience, Diplomat emerged around the mid-20th century, though never achieving the widespread recognition of Marlboro or Camel. It tried to brand itself with an aura of classy sophistication, using packaging that displayed a regal crest or emblem, echoing the wave of post-war branding that celebrated worldliness and tradition. During the 1950s and 1960s, Diplomat ads occasionally popped up in magazines or on signs at local mom-and-pop shops, showcasing images of well-dressed couples in an elegant, refined setting. However, with the intense competition among big-name brands, particularly in the 1970s when promotions reached a fever pitch, Diplomat's modest marketing budget couldn't keep up. Younger adult smokers, influenced by the cultural shifts of the era, gravitated toward edgier, more vibrant cigarette campaigns that leaned into music festivals or rebellious attitudes. Diplomat's subdued approach felt out of sync, making it more appealing to a dwindling older demographic rather than the emerging Gen X crowd. As the 1980s arrived, Diplomat's distribution channels dried up, and local stores began substituting more popular names in the limited shelf space they had. Gradually, Diplomat packs became relics, sometimes spotted in dusty boxes or collectors' showcases featuring an assortment of defunct mid-century brands. Few beyond dedicated tobacco historians or nostalgic baby boomers recall seeing Diplomat's crest peeking out from behind a store counter. Though occasionally mentioned in online forums that document obscure American nostalgia, Diplomat's disappearance is now virtually complete, serving as another example of how the intense competition and shifting cultural tastes of 20th century America caused even established cigarette brands to vanish.